Welcome back to Let's Talk. In this segment, we're going to be looking at how not to lose one negative on every roll of 120 film when using the lab box. If you've been following my journey at all, either via Let's Talk or on Night Vision magazine, then you know that I began working with film approximately 18 months ago. My first several rolls of film were developed by my friend Jim, who had a lab box. If you're not familiar with developing film, the traditional way to do it is using something called a Patterson tank. In another Let's Talk, we'll look more closely at a Patterson tank and why I decided not to go that route. From the beginning, I thought the lab box would be the better way to go. So you can imagine what it was like for me when Jim processed the first couple of rolls of film that I had shot to realize that out of every 10 images, I would only end up with 9 because one was lost in the very design of the lab box when using 120 film. Now, to be fair, as you'll see a little bit later on in this presentation, the problem is not simply with lab box. Some of it has to do with the design of 120 film. But before we go down that road and look at that, let's look more closely at how the lab box works. And let's talk about some of the reasons why I decided to go with the lab box. First and foremost, it is modular in design. So it will handle 120 film and it will handle 35 millimeter film. And since we planned on working with both, the lab box made perfect sense. Switching from 120 film to 35 millimeter is really very simple. Simply clips on the rails. Everything else, the reel, the knob, etc., is the same. By the way, this is a very old rendition of the knob. The new one is very different, as you'll see. So it made perfect sense. The other advantage to the lab box was I didn't need to carry with me a light tight bag. I could see what I was doing. It made much more sense. Except as you watch the film, the videos from Labbox, and as I learned firsthand with Jim, you will lose 1 out of every 10 images. You know, that just wasn't acceptable to me, so I was determined to find a way to get around the problem, and let's look more closely at the problem and how I solved it. So, the process with the lab box is really very simple. As you see here, this is with the 120 module attached. And you begin by inserting the exposed roll of film here. You pull the paper tab through that opening. And as you see in the photograph above, you pull the paper. As you pull the paper, the film spools into a light tight chamber. And as you see here, there are 2 positions on this lever. This one is open, this one is closed. Once this is closed, no light can get on your film. So why is it that you end up losing 1 image on every roll of film? Part of that, as I've already mentioned, is a consequence of the design of 120 film. So where 35 millimeter film coils out of and back into a canister, 120 film is actually 2 parts attached by a piece of tape. Film on one side, paper on the other. As you're shooting the film, the paper is behind the film and it prevents the film from becoming exposed. So does, hopefully, the chamber into which the film is loaded. When you develop 120 film, the only way to do it is to separate the paper from the film. That's the first problem. The second problem, if we look more closely at how the film is attached to the paper, then you're going to see that we have, if this is the roll, this is where the tape is, and this is your first image. So, as the film goes into the camera, and as you, actually, by the way, the paper will go past, you attach this to the spool or to the reel on the right side of the camera. You pull the film forward. What essentially happens at that point is that the first image is so close to the tape that there's absolutely no room. However, if we look at the full roll of film, there is at the back end unused substrate. So as I began to look at the problem, my question became, can I move some of the unused space to the front? But before we go further, let's look at the LabBox methodology. So for LabBox, the first thing you do, insert the roll. Make sure the tab is passed through the opening on the side of the chamber. We've talked about that. Pull the paper towards you. Eventually, the paper will stop. And according to LabBox, don't pull anymore. Stop right there. Turn the lever to the left. Make that chamber where the film has spooled light tight. Tear the paper, and by this point, you're tearing it on the outside of the LabBox. Raise the lid. Remove the remaining paper. At this point, you've lost one negative. Approximately 2 inches is exposed, and part of that 2 inches is, if not all, is your first image. Now, part of this will depend upon how you initially load the film, because you may only lose half of the first image if you don't load the paper precisely the way you're supposed to in a given camera. So let's take a closer look. Please keep in mind that I am using a Pentax (6x7) camera. Mine was made sometime around 1980. We're looking at the back of the camera with the door open. If you were to look closely here, you would see that this says 120 and this says 220. The only difference between 120 and 220 is that 220 has 20 images, 110 has only 10. Theoretically, this arrow, if you follow the directions, is supposed to be placed right here. If you place that arrow there, you will absolutely lose one image. Even if you follow the rest of what I'm about to say, you may not lose one completely, you may lose a quarter of it, you may lose half of it, but the point is you're losing some. So I want to make one more point, and that is, if you think about the midpoint here, equidistant between both sides of the camera back. You do not want to cross this line. If you do, you will lose one image, but it will be the 10th one on the roll. Ideally, I try to place this arrow halfway between the 120 marker and the center line of the camera back. I'll repeat. You don't want to cross this line, and you really don't want to put the arrow on that line. You want to be approximately halfway between the 120 indicator and the midpoint. Okay, so let's move on. Now, when you follow the methodology recommended by LabBox, you'll still pull the paper out. The paper will still stop, except this time when the paper stops, just pull harder. And by the way, this is a look at the fully detached paper. Close the lever again, make sure that the film is in the light tight chamber. Remove the lid, and this is what you'll see. The very tape that attaches the film to the paper will catch on a raised part of the chamber in the lab box. At that point, you're also going to open up this lever. At that point, you're going to have about this much film exposed, which should be a little bit less than the total amount of space you created by moving the film's arrow here. Now the critical part. Don't pull any more film out, because if you do, you run the risk of damaging or losing your first exposure. And again, here you can see that there is enough enough film to attach the lead and the clip to pull the film down into the chamber. So typically, if we're looking at the side of the lab box, I pull the film straight up rather. If necessary, if I don't have enough film, I take the reel out, I put my clip on, and then I put the reel back in. You can see the reel down here. And when I do that, I want to make sure that the film guide is in place. It's really that simple. Once I've done that, then I can process my film exactly the way LabBox says. So I close the gray plastic bar that rests over the film and the clip. I close the lid, I turn the crank, and I load my film. I want to make one more comment. If you look closely at this diagram, there is a metal clip that is actually curved. So the top of it is flat and the bottom part of it is curved. That's critical for guiding the film properly into the chamber where the reel is located. Make sure, one more time, make absolutely sure that the clip in the film are under the edge of that metal curved. I'm not sure what specifically to call it, but you want to make sure it's underneath this gray piece of plastic and that metal clip so that the film will be guided into the chamber. If you don't do that, the clip may get caught on this piece of metal and tear the film. So that's basically it. let's review the steps really quickly. First and most importantly, you want to position the film differently in the back of the camera. Halfway between the mark for 120 and the center line, you want to make sure the arrow is in the middle. So about halfway across that difference. Should be about 2 inches roughly. When you pull the paper and it stops, keep pulling. When all the paper is pulled, then and only then do you close the lever on the side of the tank to make sure that the film is kept light tight. Open the lid, remove the film's tape carefully. Don't pull up any more film. If you have to pull the reel out, clip it to the film, put it back in, attach the handle, which you see in part here, and make sure that the metal clip is underneath the gray bar that stretches across the tank so that your film will feed into the reel correctly. Close the cover, load the film, process from there. Well, I want to thank you for watching this episode of Let's Talk. If you have any questions, you can reach me at inquiries@nightfalcon.com. My name is Falcon. I am the senior partner of the House of Night Falcon. Thank you for your time today. Our social media contact information follows. Take care, and I look forward to creating another Let's Talk for you in the near future.
If you want to contact us, we can be reached at nightfalcon.com or our magazine site, nightvision.com. And if you want to email me directly, you can reach me at inspiration@nightfalcon.com.